Hello and welcome to Teaching It Real. My name's Mark Enter. I'm a Head of Geography and Research Lead.
And my name's Zoe Enser, and I was an English teacher for 20 years, and I'm currently working across Kent with the education people as an advisor for English. And we're really lucky today that we're being joined by Tarjinder Gill, who is a primary school teacher who's worked across Midlands, London schools and Norfolk, and has specialised previously in history and is now looking specifically at English in the primary context. And Tarjinder's joining us because we were very lucky that she wrote a case study for our book, Generative Learning in Action, focusing on the enacting strategy. What I really love about doing these sessions and the opportunity that I've had to kind of discuss with practitioners is about how this research is having an impact in the classroom and what it is that's happening in terms of the day-to-day and the learning of students. And that's what I really want to explore further. You know, writing a book and talking about the research with Logan Firella and Richard Mayer is one part of it, but what happens with that in the classroom that's going to make a difference to learning is what really has always excited me about any kind of educational research. So Tarjinder, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Yeah, really delightful to meet you properly at last after kind of passing in corridors. So before passing in corridors at Research Ed and a quick wave, it is lovely to meet you. One thing I was really interested in with generative learning is whether it's something that people have come across before. Because when we talk to people about it, we get a lot of blank faces. Is it something that you had come across? Was it a term you were familiar with?
No, it really wasn't. I have to say, the first time I came across it was the email from Zoe. So, but then as soon as I read the information that you gave, it was like, well, okay, hang on, this does sort of make sense. I mean, I have come across it, but just not using those terms. So yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? There's something that seems quite obvious, and the way they've sort of summarised it all and put it together would seem like rose and shine, something that you think we would know about, and yet it isn't. So yeah, no, I think it's great that you've written the book on it.
Yeah, I found when I looked at it, it felt like refinement. So rather than here's something absolutely brand new that you've never even considered doing in the classroom, it was could we do this slightly differently, slightly better, with a slightly different focus, which I found quite, as a teacher, quite empowering to go, then no one's telling me to do something brand new. It's just a tweak.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, isn't it? Like often, I think, particularly over the last sort of 20 years, I mean, yourself, it was always about the big ideas, the next big initiative, the next big thing that you had to do, and it had to transform everything about your practice to suddenly generate these amazing outcomes. And actually, I think one of the things that I've found, sort of since returning back to teaching the last couple of years, is that actually it's quite nice just to be able to refine it, to be able to say, actually, basically, this is fine. This is where I do need some development. But actually, these areas where I think I'm okay, or at least I'm good enough, and I'm doing a good job, actually can still tweak it, I can still make it better, or I can refine it in X way rather than having to make these big grand changes, which didn't really amount to much and sort of got binned after a little bit. I'm sure you've been there yourselves, like you've sheets and sheets, all the training behind it, and then it's just like, yeah, let's just bin that, because actually it didn't do much. And I don't think it really helped in terms of adding to teachers, like I think it was more about the initiative than us as teachers. I think, if that makes sense, it never really felt personal enough.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, coming back to what those best bets are and really drilling down to it, rather than just, as you say, trying whatever the new initiative is. And I certainly hope that generative learning doesn't fit into that, because obviously it links to an awful lot more, which, as you say, practitioners will go, yeah, I have been doing that, and I've been doing that for a number of years. So, as I said earlier, you wrote the enacting case study for us, which was fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you use the enacting strategy in a generative way in your classroom?
So the main thing that I was talking about was the use of gestures, and the use of gestures, particularly when it came to retelling narratives, but just retelling in general. So where we want the children to retain information or retain a process or an explanation. For example, mummification is like the main thing I would sort of I've used it for sort of twice now, and it does work really well. but the idea is to use gestures to support the children, both with the vocabulary, but also just with the sort of step-by-step process, so to give them that sequencing. And so the way to use it would be initially to sort of think of the gestures and to make sure that we're not overly using gestures either. You don't want to have like 10 gestures in a sentence. That's not the idea. The idea is to give the children a bit of a hook, I suppose, for each of those sentences, so that when they come to recalling, they've got something to sort of go back to that they can then use to help them. So it might just be the beginning of the sentence, like one day. It might be, you talk about the sea, and so you're just making the gesture. It doesn't always have to be about the key vocabulary, it has to be said. I think it's more about making sure they've got something to go back to and refer to. So not only would I teach them the gestures to use initially, the idea would be that actually when they retell it to their partners, they'd be using the gestures, and they can support each other actually, because if the other child doesn't quite remember what it is that the next step was, you can use a gesture to support them rather than having to retell the whole thing, and hopefully it will jog their memory. And the idea was to do it over the number of days as well, so it's not like it's a one-off thing to do in a lesson. It's actually something to go back to and see if the children have retained it. But the idea is to make sure that the focus isn't on the just retaining the gestures. The idea is that they are actually retelling the narrative, that they are re-explaining the process, whatever it might be. And so as a strategy, initially I did have to think through the gestures. I think I sort of was a bit more ad hoc, so I just would go in and kind of do the gestures and sort of try and make it up as I went along. But over time I have sort of realize that it's much better to just even have a quick look through whatever the story is, and just kind of, even if it's just to underline the word that I'm going to do the gesture for, and just have to have a quick think about it beforehand, so that I'm not sort of stood there going, oh, okay, what gesture am I going to do next? Because that breaks up the learning process. And the idea is to make it quite, to make it quite fluid. But also in terms of teaching in itself, the use of enactment, the use of gestures makes it very sort of responsive, and it means the children are engaging with the retelling in a way they wouldn't normally do. Now, I might do that in conjunction, particularly when it comes to a narrative, would probably do that in conjunction with a story map as well. So you'd have a story map to support them, but then almost the gesture is the next step away to make it a bit more abstract. So you can use it that way too. So it's not like it's either or, you can do both. But the idea would be that ultimately the children will be able to retell the story. And those gestures, particularly in writing, and those gestures would just support them to sort of remember and not to miss bits out or miss chunks out.
I think it's interesting you mentioned there the kind of the abstract concrete. And so part of this process is to perhaps give them something a bit more concrete, or as you suggested, maybe the other way. So they're making something a bit more abstract from it. So that's interesting, that the idea that you could work both ways in terms of that.
Yeah, kind of bridging the two.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to always be that, because I think the problem with story maps is sometimes children get fixated on the actual picture that you've got there and then sort of forget the words around it necessarily. So this is a way of saying, okay, fine, we'll move away from that slightly and sort of get it back to the oral retelling. But the idea of the story map would be the oral retelling as well. However, the idea isn't that, the gestures mean that the children have got to use certain words, have got to phrase the story or the retelling in the exact way that you as an adult have said it to them as a teacher. The idea would be that actually they would vary the phrases, they would vary the ideas, but at the same time that they would have something to just go back to refer to, as opposed to just having to retell it and then forgetting bits about it, because that's always the danger in retelling a story, is that actually they will miss out sort of important parts of it. So the other key thing is to make sure that when one is sort of doing that retelling aspect and using the gestures, is actually have you really distilled it down to the main events anyway, or the main parts of the process anyway, and to make sure there's not too much superfluousness in the first place, so that you're not then having lots and lots of gestures to learn. Like I said, you don't want a situation where they've got 50 gestures, because that just doesn't help. You're then sort of getting to the point where actually it becomes about them trying to recall all these gestures and not actually just going through what they need to.
I think you're kind of already starting to talk about this idea in terms of if there are too many gestures, or if you do something ad hoc. But do you think there are any other kind of limitations for this as a particular approach? Do you think it's group specific or phase specific in your experience? Where else might it potentially go wrong?
I think Personally, I think, you know, it would work really, really well for obviously younger children, particularly in primary. So I wouldn't know what it would be like for older pupils, particularly in secondary. Would they think it's kind of childish? You know, would that be a barrier then for them using those gestures? I don't know. I think that would be interesting to find out if secondary teachers do use gestures in a similar way and what they found. Certainly with my year fives, I'm a bit more sparing, I think, at the moment with the number of gestures that I use. I don't necessarily use it for every sentence either. So I think in terms of refining it, whereas with my year threes, I felt like I needed to use it in every sentence to sort of help them, you know, support them with their development of their memory and their retention of the story. I think with year fives, because they're a little bit more mature, it's possible to sort of use fewer gestures, but to make sure that it's used for the events that I think that they're more likely to forget. Or for the details that I want them to really remember and retain. So it's a case of refining it over time and saying, okay, what does each group actually need? Do they need to have it for every sentence because they're struggling with remembering, they're struggling with retaining the knowledge, or is it they need it just for specific aspects of, like I said, vocabulary or events or characters that have just come, you know, new characters that have been introduced that maybe they'll find tricky to remember. So it's about thinking through, what does a class actually need this for? Because ultimately they've got amazing memories, and you tell them a story and they can just remember it. Actually, there isn't any point in just kind of spending a lot of time using gestures to retell the story for the sake of it. It is there for a specific reason.
Yeah, I think one of the boundary conditions that came up through the research was that if you're actually using it with students who are more expert, and they don't need to kind of make that movement from abstract, concrete and abstract in the same way, that it can add a layer of confusion where there may not be. But I think some of the work in mathematics where they're looking at manipulatives, I think could be an interesting link to this idea of what we can do to make those things a bit more concrete for students. Thank you.
Yeah, so as secondary school teacher, I mean, I use gesture occasionally. So things like attrition. So, hammering together as opposed to abrasion, because the kids always confuse the two, but actually they start to see the difference and understand the difference if they actually do that, in part because their knuckles hurt. Then they remember attrition.
That's a whole new style of approach there, isn't it?
Well, yeah. But I think, when I was writing the enacting chapter, it was something that I think it was David Didal picked up on his It's Your Time You're Wasting interview that he did with us. He felt that the enacting chapter was probably the most wary of the chapters, that when I was writing it, there seemed to be lots of, here's a boundary condition, here's a reason not to use it, here's a reason to be cautious. And it did raise a few eyebrows that we had for the case study that we had, Tarjinder, the kind of, very traditional primary school teacher with a very kind of clear approach in terms of directing and explicit instruction, writing about enacting, which they had seen as a very kind of progressive way of teaching. Do you see a conflict there at all, or is it just a misunderstanding of what enacting is or what traditional teaching is?
I think probably a bit of both. I mean, philosophically, I think you could be traditional or progressive and still use activities and ideas from either sort of school. I think, generally speaking, we probably are on a spectrum. I think in terms of the debate, I think it is important to outline that there are these different philosophies and why they believe what they believe. But I don't think it goes against the idea of traditional teaching at all. If you think about it, the use of gestures isn't there as a kind of just as a hook or as a gimmick. And I'm not saying that that's what progressive teachers do. That's not fair. But what I'm saying is it's not that, it's there for a very specific purpose. And if you understand sort of traditional teaching, if we're saying that we're focusing on the knowledge, we're focusing on directly teaching the children what that knowledge is and what's important, then actually all it does is it supports it. It's just another way of supporting that and drawing attention to those key aspects of knowledge or the key events or the key aspects of the process. So like I said, with something like mummification, it is important to sort of talk about, like, if you talk about the heart or something, you can just make the gestures so they know what you're talking about while they're doing it, so they distinguish between the different body parts even. Now, something like that is actually interesting, because you could get too far into the sort of making gestures for body. You have to think, okay, is it worth it? Like, do I really want to sort of like work out what a liver looks like? Actually, no, you can just kind of point to the body at that point in time. And that's the thing about the gestures. It's not always making a gesture that's that refers to the word, or like, some sort of movement. It can just be you pointing to your eyes. It can just be whatever whatever it is that you think is important to that point in time. And there's lots of different ways of doing it. So to me, it just means I'm focused exactly on what I want the children to learn. So in that respect, actually, it makes no difference. And I think, I do always credit Christine Council for this one, because I think for her, no activity in itself is progressive or traditional. That's just out the window. So it's more your approach to teaching that is. And then when it comes to actually the activity itself, the key thing is the focus on the knowledge. So if you're focusing on the knowledge, how can you deliver that knowledge the best? And actually, it's been brilliant the last couple of years to really stop and think, okay, actually, sometimes it will be doing a bit of role play. Sometimes it will be that, if you want to, for example, explain something like trade, then actually a little bit of role play makes a lot of sense, rather than like using a definition or trying to get the children to understand it in a very abstract way. Getting the children just to act it out, but why they're acting it out, and they're not just doing it for the sake of it. And same thing, like say with something like gestures, it's not being done for the sake of it. So I'm not there in a maths lesson doing gestures just because I think gestures are a good idea. And I think that's kind of where it sort of falls down both with traditional and progressive teaching methods, is that if you're using them for the sake of using them, or you're using the activities associated with those philosophical outlooks for the sake of using it, same thing with retrieval practice, same thing with anything, then actually you're probably not using it to its best effect. You have to know why you're doing that particular thing. Why are you doing retrieval practice at the beginning of the lesson? What is it that you're doing? Because, and actually, it doesn't have to be, this set standard of, right, we're going to do 10 questions to retrieve information. Well, actually, you might not have 10 things from the last lesson that you want to retrieve, right? And it may be that the most important thing is that the children retain or remember something else. So, I'm just thinking of a very recent lesson. We did like an ancient Egyptian god and goddess sort of family tree. But I wanted them to retain that information because it then would make sense for the next layer down. So there's a real reason for it, because unless they did that, they wouldn't understand the sort of the sons and daughters of the next set of gods and how they all relate back to each other. So that was the point of it. And again, something like I said with gestures, the point of it is that actually I do, particularly in religion at the moment, I do want them to retell a lot of the stories, because again, we've got kind of a family tree going on. So we're teaching them a lot of the Bible stories and focusing on, the sort of on Abraham and then his descendants, and really getting them to understand that initial concept of, him becoming the father of a great nation. What did that actually mean? Well, actually, you need to go all the way back. But if they're not sort of retaining some of the key information, the key sort of the key characters, they're going to get confused quite quickly. And then how does it relate all the way back? So getting them to retell those stories and go back and retell other stories is really important. And using gestures like that over time can be really helpful, because actually you can just sort of prompt them with a gesture as opposed to lots and lots of talk.
I love this kind of glimpse into the primary school classroom. It's brilliant. I think I just don't think we get enough of as teachers is that ability to look into another phase and what happens in the classroom there. I just love talking to primary school teachers and seeing that world. And one question we get asked quite a bit about generative learning, does this apply to primary schools? Is this something which goes across phases? I was just wondering, the other strategies that we talk about in the book, things like, I think you mentioned kind of retrieval practice, but there's imagining, summarizing, mapping. Are they all, do you think, applicable to primary? Are they all ones that you use, or are there some that you wouldn't really use with younger children that maybe you would with older? Or any thoughts there?
I mean, I think something like summarizing, for example, is not so much that I wouldn't use it, but I think it takes a fair bit of teaching. you know, and it takes a fair bit of practice before the children can do it themselves. And it's not just a case of okay, here, there you go, you know, you do a summarizing exercise. Actually, we need to really think quite carefully about what do we want them to summarize. So I would get them to very much go from, say, trying to summarize, say, 2 or 3 sentences, you know, very small chunks of text or very small bits of a story, to then gradually, you know, sort of growing that to sort of to a chapter sort of later on, say year 5 or 6. It's not something that they can just leap to. So I think it's not so much that I wouldn't use it, but I think in terms of it, would it be an independent activity? That's the real question. And probably I would not do that until quite late on. I think it would take a lot of joint summarization before the children would really get that, and in lots of different contexts as well. They'd need to really understand what it is they're trying to summarize and why, and how to really do that and retain the main parts, because that's the important thing. And of course, for younger pupils, because it's all new, it's not always clear what's important. You know, again, developing that sense of what is important matters. But things like, for example, drawing and mapping, you know, I suppose it depends on how you interpret it, but say drawing, like talk for writing, is quite a standard technique in a lot of primary schools, and it works brilliantly, you know. So we would do that quite a bit, you know, say things like story maps. Again, I think it depends on, you know, we always have to think, why are we doing this? You know, am I doing it for the sake of it? With talk for writing, it's a very, very clear purpose why you would create a story map and what it is that you want the children to do with it. Like I said, yeah, I do think the enacting can move you away from that a little bit, just so that you don't want children to become reliant on that, particularly in Key Stage 2. But at the same time, you want to give pupils sort of ways in that they can actually still retain that, and they're not just sitting there going, well, I just don't remember, you know, like they're sort of shrugging of the shoulders, because actually it is hard to retain quite a lot of information all the time, and we are teaching them all these different subjects ourselves. So while we can make a lot of links between them, actually for the children to make those links independently is not always that straightforward. So actually doing a story map in sort of religion, and then doing another one in as part of literature, and then doing it again, say in history, it actually starts to get them to understand, oh, hang on, there are narratives across the board. But those kind of ideas are quite abstract, and the children wouldn't make that link. They wouldn't think of the stories being necessarily the same in all those different contexts. The same thing with the use of gestures, actually, for them to realize that, hang on, we're using gestures for a specific thing. To use it in science, and then to use it in history, and then to use it across, you know, in different subject areas. It's important for them to understand the difference between that, and also to see that actually, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, it doesn't matter. What they're really doing is they're focusing on the information.
You're right, that is a lot for young children to grasp, isn't it? You know, I spend quite a bit of time doing, you know, how do we draw mind maps? Why do we draw them in certain ways? How do we use them? So that in the future they can get to the point where they can use it themselves. But that is a long process. You know, I'm not expecting the year 7s to go and do that themselves by the time they get to maybe year 10, 11, but I've had years of ingraining it, building on it, putting it in. I wonder if sometimes the secondary school teachers, or maybe even just me, just personally, kind of forget that you are just dealing with it often a year. You're with those particular pupils for a year, and you might be with them a lot for that year, but it is just for a year. Whereas I might actually be with a group of pupils for less time, but I'm doing that for 7 years. And I'm taking them on a 7-year journey myself with those things. I don't think I've ever quite considered that before.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because actually you do see the different year groups in a slightly different way, and it's part. And I think, you know, these days it's not necessarily the case, because we do move around from year group to year group quite a bit in primary. I think, you know, that's important for our own professional development. But it is possible to sort of be in a phase and not really understand the other phase quite so much. But I think that's where sort of whole school policies have to come in. So with anything, I think, you know, if you sort of look back at some of those techniques like mapping or summarizing or even enacting, actually we probably should have that discussion properly as a whole school. It shouldn't just be about you personally as a teacher, even if that's me doing it at this point in time. You know, actually it's really interesting to have that discussion, say, okay, how are we using it, and are we scaffolding, are we taking away these scaffolds over time, and if we are, how are we doing that? What are we finding in our classrooms? Are we finding there's an issue with age and age appropriateness? And I think that would be sort of the next step for me, I think, is, you know, in terms of developing some of these techniques, is actually saying, okay, so how does that work in, say, in reception compared to year 5?
I think there's there's a subject issue there, you know, because you make those links for the students, but in the same way, you know, me summarising in English, somebody in history might be using summarising in a slightly different way and have a different approach. So those kind of conversations about strategy, which people can then take away, is really important. But all the time, what you've been talking about in terms of the purpose, the why are we using that, why are we investing in this strategy, is this the right strategy? I think that's always really, really important. And then how are we actually using that, are all really important points, which translate very much to secondary as well.
I think one of the sort of most freeing aspects at the moment is moving away from like the big the silver bullet approach of trying to improving outcomes. Is actually, I think it will actually open up more avenues for primary and secondary to have these discussions. If you think about it, if we're doing it in a particular way, then you're doing it in a particular way. It makes sense to then go back and forth, because actually, should I be using enacting in a slightly different way in science compared to English? Like, it'd be fascinating then to go back to, okay, how do you do it? How do you use summarising? How do you use mapping in these different subjects? And then sort of bring that back in and refine it, because obviously the danger in primary would be to take any of these strategies but to use it in a very samey way across the board, and that might not be the wrong thing to do at all. It might be exactly the right thing to do, and in fact, going back to yourselves, you might go, actually, hang on, why are we doing it slightly differently? It might be the case that for any one of these strategies that you would then go, actually, hang on, they're using it slightly differently, but it works, so maybe I should be taking that on board, just to sort of bring that back. And I think the problem with the silver bullet approach was always that everybody was using a slightly different silver bullet, so then how could you ever have those conversations about improving teaching? We couldn't, could we? And so I really do hope that we do get to have more and more sort of collaboration between primary and secondary, because I think that's a really important way forward as well. But I think that's something that's been a barrier for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, completely agree there. And hopefully this is the start of some of those conversations going even further.
Yeah, as long as we keep talking. Well, thank you very much for giving up some of your half term to talk to us today. We do appreciate it, and it's been lovely chatting to you.
Thank you again for writing the case study too. I really appreciate it.
Thank you as well.
Thank you.